And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We turn now to Greece, which is bracing for protests after Eurozone finance ministers concluded a deal Tuesday that will provide Greece with $170 billion in funding it needs to avoid default next month. Greek Finance Minister Evangelos Venizelos hailed the deal.
Today's decisions in Brussels are the result of a very complicated and painful negotiation. In negotiation, I don't want to compare it to other historical negotiations, but with regards to the political consequences of economic impact and economic and social consequences, it is perhaps the most important of the post-war era.
The $170 billion bailout for Greece will force Athens to commit to making another round of deep austerity cuts. As part of the deal, Greek workers are expected to suffer further wage cuts larger than the 15% already planned for the next 3 years. Under the agreement, Greece's private creditors have agreed to take deeper losses on their Greek debts. The bailout is being opposed by several unions and left-wing groups in Greece. Civil servants have been hard hit by the austerity measures which began in 2010. Wages and pensions have been reduced, benefits cut, and 10,000 people laid off in 2011. Under the new package, another 15,000 civil servants will be laid off this year. Additional pension cuts will affect both the public and private sector. The Vice President of the Confederation of Civil Servants has been particularly critical of the deal.
The new loan agreement and, more significantly, the new measures that accompany it are catastrophic for Greek society and the prospects of the country. Not only will it drive people and the society to poverty, but will increase the recession and the state's problems. And that way, there will be no prospects. We are fighting for different policies, a different policy mix that will take the country to growth.
For more on the Greek bailout, on how people there will be affected by the austerity measures, as well as the financial crisis here in the United States, we're joined by Pol Μέισον, economics editor at BBC Newsnight. He just returned from Greece. His latest book is Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions. Welcome to Democracy Now! You're just back from Greece. It's great to have you back here in our studios. Tell us what is happening here and the significance of this latest bailout and, in fact, who's being bailed out.
Well, what makes the headlines are, of course, the riots, and the riots continue. I've been covering these events for the last 2 years. They get more and more intense. What doesn't make so many headlines is what is happening to real people. I was able to visit a clinic in the Piraeus port. It had been set up to deal with people who fall through the social security net, which is mainly undocumented migrants. So it was volunteer doctors and free healthcare and free food. That's about as basic as it gets. In the last 6 months, they've been swamped by Greek citizens because Greek citizens are falling through the safety net in a Europe that is supposed to be what Americans think of it as a quasi-socialist. It has a welfare state, and yet we are seeing those starving people and homeless people, huge numbers of drug addicts and homeless people on the streets. It looks and begins to look really almost borderline developing world parts of Greece now.
Can you explain, though, Poll Μέisον, why is it that Greeks themselves are falling through the social safety net? I mean, healthcare, why is it that they no longer have access to healthcare? They have a system whereby you pay a little bit into the healthcare, and you pay a bit for your medicines, and you pay a little bit for your treatment. But what's happened is, of course, the solutions imposed on Greece by the IMF and the European Union have involved raising taxes very dramatically. So they had an austerity tax that they collect through the electricity bill. Somebody showed me their electricity bill, €350 per month. So what is that in dollars? 400. But most of that is tax, and if you don't pay it, your electricity stops. Now this person earned €500 per month. So the money you have to pay for your healthcare is just it's food first, then healthcare. So people just can't afford it.
Some analysts see a concerted campaign by Eurozone countries to isolate Greece as much as possible in preparation for an eventual default and exit from the euro. But Greek Finance Minister Venizelos yesterday hailed the bailout package and said it demonstrates Greece will remain part of the Eurozone regardless of what happens.
Έχουμε την σαφή, ρητή και επίσημη δέσμευση των εταίρων μας.
We have the clear, official, and explicit commitment from our partners that they will support us even after the program. In other words, after January 1st, 2015, until Greece believes that it is possible to return to the markets, Thus, this is a long-term support. In other words, a clear political decision that Greece is and will continue to be a member of the Eurozone, whatever happens.
Your response, Poll Μέισον.
Well, look, you would like to believe that they could win, they could beat all odds and stay in the euro and avoid default. But up to now, every one of the failed bailout packages was signed off by the IMF and the EU, and they all involved meeting the Greek problem with austerity. So you cut spending, you raise taxes, you impoverish people. Leave aside the minimum wage. Wages in general are going to have to fall 15 to 20% to meet in the private sector. This is no longer just a public sector thing. Now, I think, and most analysts think, that they are on a route to default, and that the last week's or this week's deal has basically been about ring-fencing the rest of the Eurozone for if and when that happens. Having been there, I think it's when. And then there's on top of that the whole question of political instability. You mentioned left-wing groups in your introduction. I think there's a bit in the mainstream media, there's a bit of a does not compute going on. The combined vote for the communists, Trotskyists and ecologists, so these are left-wing parties with hammer and sickle on their flags, is 43% right now in the polls. That dwarfs the equivalent of the GOP and the Democrats. And I think there's an element of we don't want to see that, but that is what you get when people are told, your life is, your future's over. There's no way, I think, from any early election that a stable government can emerge that can do this thing they've agreed to do.
So what do you think the effect of that will be? I mean, this change in the political landscape, vis-a-vis a couple of things. First of all, well, I mean, immediately the Greek parliament has to apparently approve the bailout package. Yeah. What's the likelihood that that'll happen? And then in the future, because many, of course, say, including yourself, that this is by far from a solution to the problem. Will the political landscape change in such a way? I mean, will left-wing parties actually come to power in such a way that whatever subsequent way is found to deal with this crisis, these negotiations will not continue in the same vein?
On the question of the Parliament, I think certainly they'll pass the measures. What's happening, though, is the two parties, because these two parties are there from the last election 3 years ago, so they have a majority right now, even though their popularity is slumping. I think as they pass them, more and more MPs are chipped off, and these two parties in power splitting is not great. If they then stand for elections and their own members get to ask them, well, what are you going to do about this? During an election, pressure goes on the mainstream parties as well as the ones at the extreme. And, of course, the right as well as the left are growing as a result of this crisis. And remember, this is a country that had a civil war between the right and left after World War II. So I think that's on that situation. I think they're just not going to be able to make it work. The instability is going to bring down the plan. Or it's 90% certain in my mind that the instability in Greece will just... You can't push through this level of austerity with a weak government.
I want to go to the people of Greece, where you were with your report from inside Greece. This is a clip from one of those recent reports, Poll Μέισον in Greece for Newsnight of BBC.
As the crisis deepens, the weakest and the poorest suffer, nowhere more so than those who are not supposed to be in Greece at all. This is Patras, the ferry port that links Greece to Western Europe. Right on the seafront, hundreds of illegal migrants live in this shattered factory. I'm taken in by an activist from a local NGO. The migrants got here because government cutbacks have made the Greek border highly porous. How easy is it to get into Greece?
How easy? It's too easy.
It's too easy?
Too easy.
Why?
Why? Because, the border's not closed, the border's open.
They survive on charity. They receive no assistance at all from the Greek state. But as the economy has collapsed, so too has sympathy for the migrants.
There's no Europe. Believe me. There's no Europe.
It doesn't feel like Europe?
No.
Why?
No, I used to live in London. There's no Europe. Believe me, there's no look like Europe. The police can hit you. The people can swear you for no reason. The people hate us like animal. What's the life there?
This man, a graduate from Darfur, is headed for London. He can't wait to see the back of Greece. How long have you been in this factory place?
In the factory here, I have 60 months and 3 months in the train there.
Yeah.
Before we came here, because the police is forced us to leave the train. Then we came here in the abandoned factory. I have 60 months here.
Do you think the economic crisis has made the situation for migrants worse?
Yes.
Why? Tell me.
We are going to the market, so I think
they give you some food at the end.
Some foods and also some money, you know.
And there's less now.
Yeah, now the situation is changing because of the economic crisis.
They drink from a pipe in the ground. Some have died from fires lit to keep warm. It's shocking to see this in a continent that once prided itself on a social model, but the crisis has turned so much of Greece upside down. For Greek youth, the situation too looks dire. 50% of those under 24 are unemployed. And among them, the extremes of politics are growing. In a bar run by one of the far-left groups, I meet the people who've got together to feed and clothe the migrants. None is actually a member of a left party. All intend to vote for one, and all have been participants in disorderly protests.
There's no future for us. Generally, there's no future. We can't dream, we can't live. For us, this is a disaster.
But I've been hearing young Greek people say that to me for 3 years now. What do you do about it?
We're fighting, we're trying to convince other people and to make them understand that all this crisis is a result of the capitalist system.
Do you seriously think there could be a left-wing government in Greece?
I don't think it's going to be a non-violent government from the left. It's going to be a civil war.
In a way the carpenter, the teacher, the engineer, the social worker, these are professional people, but the ideas they're espousing have become commonplace. And what it's about is work. There isn't any.
If there is no war, there is a revolution against the government.
A report from inside Greece by BBC Newsnight editor PolΜέisον, who's in the studio with us now, has just written the book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions. Make this broader now, from Greece to Europe, and what this also means to the United States.
Well, it's Greece, it's Europe, it's North Africa. We are living in a time where the world has, in the last couple of years, erupted in a way that many people thought they would never see again since the 1960s. And I think the Greek events, I mean, Greece isn't all riots. It's Occupy camps. They had one of the first ones called the Indignados camp in their main square. In Europe, across southern Europe, I think only me and Glenn Beck have been talking about this in a way. I have seen the crossover, the potential crossover from North Africa to southern Europe to the United States, and the similarities between what is happening. I take a more standing above it standpoint than Glenn does, but there are links, there are common factors, and the most important one everywhere is what you saw in that bar, what I call the graduate without a future. You find them on Tahrir Square, you find them in Syntagma Square, Greece, you'll find them outside, in Zuccotti Park, New York. Once the economic crisis switched off that narrative that things are going to get better, you'll have a better life than your parents, I think people in the Middle East lost their fear. People in Europe and America have lost their apathy. And there's a lot to be sort of angry about once you look at real life. In my book, one of the chapters in it is where I drive from Oklahoma to LA following the route that Steinbeck's Jode family took.
Let's go to that trip. Tell us, lay the context for us. We have a clip.
We're in an economic crisis. There's a drought in Oklahoma last summer. I thought, well, let's just drive along 66 or parallel to 66 and see what it's like now. It's stunning what you find. I think much of the mainstream media misses this. One of the most amazing things was to find a homeless encampment in Albuquerque, which of course was set up again. There's always this parallel for people who maybe had drug and alcohol problems. But now, what are the people who running it say? The people coming in are the American middle class, people who've been running a branch of McDonald's, holding down a decent managerial job. 2 weeks later, homeless, jobless, and sleeping on the floor with 80-odd people they don't know.
Let's go to a clip of Pol Meison's report as he traveled across the United States, retracing the steps of John Steinbeck's Jode family from the Grapes of Wrath. Here you're reporting from Joy Junction, that homeless shelter in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Normally, the families who come here are coping with drink, drugs, domestic violence, but now there's a new kind of customer, the American middle class.
I'm Larry Antista. This is my daughter, Michelle. We're here because of the economic times. My spouse took off on us, and that cut our income in half, and we lost our place, and here we are.
They've been living like this for 3 months. He's a truck driver by trade, but he can't find work, so he works for his welfare payments, $300 a month. Michelle, aged 14, is still at school.
Do the people at school know where you sleep every night?
No, not really.
You don't tell them?
No.
Why?
They didn't ask, so figure don't tell them.
So you don't show up as homeless, even in the school statistics? No. The sort of rich of America really, and the media, really understand that every night thousands of people are bedding down like this?
No.
No.
And what would you say to them if you could speak to them right now?
If they could live just like one day of like our lives, they'd see how hard it is and like how good they have it. Because a lot of them complain about what they got, which is really dumb.
Voices of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a homeless shelter captured by a British observer of the United States, Pol Μέisον, economics editor of BBC Newsnight, as he traveled across the United States and has just returned from Greece. His new book is called Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions. Paul, I wanted to read to you the Financial Times reporting that U.S. taxpayers will subsidize part of the $26 billion settlement owed by 5 leading banks to resolve claims over faulty foreclosures and mortgage practices. A clause in the provisional agreement, which has not been made public, allows the banks to count future loan modifications made under a previous foreclosure prevention initiative toward their restructuring obligations for the new settlement. This is quite something. So this was a big deal that was worked out with all the U.S. attorneys general in the United States and the banks, supposedly penalizing them, a $26 billion settlement, but in fact a bailout for them. Are we seeing all of this, these bailouts from Greece to the United States? Are they again bailouts for the entities that are too big to fail?
It's hard not to see the Greek bailout as a way of protecting the European banking system. It's hard not to read that report as, yet again, a decision to bail out banks and bankrupt countries, because don't forget this, the financial markets at the moment are focused on Greece and Europe. The moment that is solved, they will focus on your country, because you are $14 trillion in debt, and there is doubt about whether your institutions can one day deliver the austerity that those financial markets will demand to make that debt stable. So I think, look, the underpinnings of this new global unrest are that from Cairo to Greece to New York to Albuquerque, people are sick of seeing the rich get richer during a crisis. That's what they're sick of. And until we start hearing solutions, both at the grassroots level and at the top level in politics, that go beyond that explain to us what the new story is about capitalism, these revolutions, the unrest, the protests, I think, will go on, because it is about a generation that doesn't know what the story is anymore. What is the story about how my life is going to get better? Once you do that, and then you add in networking and technology and the ability to express oneself and move around the mainstream media, you're in for years, I think, of discontent.
Before we conclude, Poll Μέisον, I wanted to ask you about a report, a confidential report that was leaked by the Financial Times, which showed that Greece's debt projections, even under the most optimistic scenario, the austerity measures now being imposed on Athens risk a recession that's even deeper than what Greece is in now.
And nobody believes the most optimistic scenario. I mean, look, they're in what economists call a death spiral. So the economy's shrinking and the debt's getting bigger. Of course, Greece has had a big debt write-off, and that is tangible, that's real and material, and it will be welcome. But as they try to implement the austerity, I think most observers think they can't do it, and if they did, it will produce a deep recession that will make the lives of the people I saw on those streets very angry, very dislocated from politics, even more harsh, and they will get even angrier, if not despairing. Some are already beyond the anger stage. Some are in a state of just individual despair. Greece is an extreme, an outlier, but it does, of course, it does show what happens if you let your debt get out of control. It also shows what happens if you only see austerity as the solution to indebtedness.
We want to thank you very much for being with us. Poll Μέισον, economics editor of BBC Newsnight, just returned from Greece. His latest book is Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, The New Global Revolutions. This is Democracy.